Welcome to the UN ESCAP online course for negotiating regional trade agreements for trade in times of crisis and pandemic. My name is Katrin Kuhlman, and I am a visiting professor at Georgetown University Law Center and the president and founder of the New Markets Lab, a law and development center. This is Module 2, the COVID-19 pandemic and countries' responses. This session will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on countries and the resulting policy responses, setting the stage for the chapters that will follow on particular issue areas addressed by regional trade agreements. The handbook itself was developed against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, which the UN declared the worst collapse of economic activity since the 1930s Great Depression. Countries have lost labor income, the informal sector in many countries has been gravely impacted, and the tourism sector has seen a particular loss of revenue, along with increases in public sector debt ratios. Due to the COVID-19 crisis and resulting measures, the World Bank has estimated that the total number of people living in poverty could rise up to 150 million. Trade and services fell by 30% in the second quarter of 2020, and FDI fell by 42%. WTO statistics show a 20% year-on-year contraction for global trade, with some recovery in the third quarter of 2021. In particular, women have been left vulnerable to domestic violence during COVID-19, as isolation measures have been imposed. Countries have imposed a number of measures since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and a number of these have been trade restrictive. During the first 10 months of 2020, G20 members undertook 1,371 policy interventions, out of which 1,067 were harmful for trading partners. Countries imposed temporary export bans on essential goods such as PPE, cleaning supplies, pharmaceutical products, and food. Argentina, Brazil, and Costa Rica, for example, imposed export licensing requirements for goods required to fight COVID-19. And vaccine-producing nations like the United States imposed export restrictions on vaccines and raw materials needed for their production. However, not all measures taken during the pandemic have been trade restrictive. Countries in the Arab region adopted measures including offering low-cost licenses for exports, exempting commodities from import taxes, accepting customs documents in electronic format, and other measures. Australia adopted temporary tariff concessions to facilitate the importation of face masks, gloves, disinfectants, and COVID-19 tests. And India implemented a 24/7 customs clearance facility to avoid supply chain disruptions. Overall, however, there was a lack of coordination between states, and many of these measures were done in a haphazard manner. Ideally, multilateral, regional, and bilateral legal and regulatory frameworks for international trade should be designed to address challenges arising from a crisis. The current framework, however, did not show that it has the flexibility and adaptability to address these challenges, and it fell short of protecting the needs of vulnerable stakeholders and states in a number of instances. At the multilateral level, it's really important to note that when countries resorted to emergency health measures, they were primarily justified under an exception clause. The primary one of these, of course, is the general exception clause set out in GATT Article 20, which allows for countries to deviate from their trade obligations in the interest of certain non-economic considerations, including the protection of human health, provided that such deviation is neither arbitrary nor discriminatory. Article 21 of the GATT contains a security exception, which allows countries to take necessary action during times of national or international emergencies, also in a non-arbitrary and non-discriminatory manner. RTAs could be tailored to address pandemic-related challenges, as they are easier to negotiate, provide a platform for deeper integration, and have already incorporated WTO Plus and WTO X provisions. Some RTAs also contain provisions that address the needs of vulnerable stakeholders, like small nations, SMEs, and women. But it is important to note that RTAs cannot take the place of a multilateral system of rules. To understand how RTAs could be crafted to become more crisis responsive, it is also important to understand how RTA provisions have been used during the pandemic and crisis, as well as where new disciplines could be incorporated to better handle future crises. Before turning to the following modules, which will include deep dives in the issues covered in the handbook, it's important to note again that RTAs were not negotiated with an impending crisis in mind. During the pandemic, countries resorted to a number of measures, both trade restrictive and trade facilitative, that highlight areas for reform. RTAs could be crafted to incorporate provisions based on trade facilitative measures with the aim of trying to mitigate the effects of trade restrictive measures. In essential goods, RTAs do not generally include provisions related to essential goods. Defining essential goods and identifying a list of essential goods will be a challenge for future crises, as the nature of crisis may differ. In terms of RTA options, RTAs could establish criteria for identifying essential goods, as APEC has suggested. RTAs could also establish additional disciplines on the application of export restrictions, enhancing transparency and facilitating trade by streamlining procedures related to essential goods. The pandemic also highlighted the importance of essential services, and RTAs do not generally contemplate minimizing disruptions in this area. RTA provisions could, however, focus on fast-tracking entry channels for services providers, mutual recognition of qualifications of high-skilled essential services providers, and mechanisms to ensure that ad hoc regulations are necessary, non-discriminatory, and proportionate. Trade facilitation, of course, is important at any time, especially during a crisis. And trade agreements do contain provisions on trade facilitation. However, many include best endeavor language, which can impede reliability and effectiveness, as pointed out by the United Nations. Many countries also lack the capacity to implement trade facilitation measures. Here, RTAs could adopt options that are more binding and include provisions addressing implementation challenges, incorporating provisions on simplification of border procedures, for example, improved access to information and cooperation, facilitation of express shipments, and expedited release of essential goods could be particularly critical. And SPS and TBT measures are also very important during a time of crisis, and particularly relevant since they focus on ensuring human health and safety. Here, RTA options could be crafted to respond to needs in terms of mutual recognition of standards for essential goods and capacity building mechanisms for SPS and TBT. With respect to intellectual property rights, there is a need to reassess IPR provisions that curb access to medicines, vaccines, and medical equipment. RTA options that give effect to compulsory licensing commitments at the multilateral level encourage innovation, and reduce adverse effects on public health could be explored. For digital trade, there is not yet a multilateral framework or any agreement on general principles of digital trade that could apply in a crisis situation or otherwise. RTAs have already been innovating in this area and could further incorporate provisions on cross-border data flows, data privacy, electronic transactions, and consumer protection, tailoring them to crisis situations. For transparency, although the WTO has a process for countries to notify measures, it is reported that many countries failed to notify during the pandemic. States could adopt the information pooling and dissemination measures that were adopted at the multilateral level, as well as regional and national levels, to allow access to updated information. Further, RTAs could obligate states to notify trade restrictive obligations in an expedited manner. States could further increase accountability by subjecting disputes related to essential goods to dispute settlement. And of course, development has been an important consideration during the pandemic and otherwise. Here, capacity building constraints and lack of tailored assistance and provisions for low-income parties have been an issue. Future reforms could include diverse aspects of development. This could mean integrating special and differential treatment provisions that are particularly tailored to deal with differences in states' capacities and capabilities, technical assistance, non-reciprocity, and flexibility that could be exercised during time of crisis. It could also include integrating sustainable development and issues related to building forward better interregional trade agreements in a more substantial way. So to conclude this module, here are some of the sources that were noted during this presentation and in the chapter itself. Thank you so much, and see you for the next session.